So the idea of this talk started a long time ago in 2011. I used to give this talk called CSS3 Secrets, because CSS3 was a thing back then. You now know that there's no such thing as CSS3, but back then it was the buzzword. And it had 10 things you may not know about CSS, like 10 tips. Apart from them all being CSS tips, they had nothing else in common. It was just cool stuff that I wanted to share about CSS. And then I did a sequel, more CSS secrets the next year. And then for the next 5 years, I was doing more specific talks about color, talks about border radius, talks about CSS variables. And I've always wanted to do a third sequel, a second sequel of this series. And today I'm presenting this second sequel for the first time, and I hope you like it. So let's start with the first one. You might have noticed in the cover of this talk, this cutout text effect. And I'm going to show you how to actually do this effect with the least amount of CSS. So here as a starting point, I have a heading with a white color and a black background. Obviously, this won't include like all the code used for this, because I don't need to show you how like the background image showing these two ladies is applied or anything. I'm just going to show you the relevant parts of this. So how many of you have heard of blending modes? About half or a third, I would say. So blending modes allow us to control how the current element blends with whatever is behind it. And specifically here, the multiply blend mode is very useful, because as you will see, once I apply it, I actually get the cutout text effect. But notice that if I didn't have a black background here, if I had, say, my favorite pink, that wouldn't quite work. I would get a different effect. It might be a nice effect. I might want that effect, but it's not a cutout text effect. This only works with black. And I'm going to show you a different technique for white. And I have not found a solution for any other color. So, but why does this work? Because if I just tell you like this one line and it works, and if you use it, you get this effect, what's the point? It's just one more thing to memorize. So I made this little application which lets you specify two colors, and you can play with it after the talk, because my slides are online. So you can input like two CSS colors here, any color work, even like named colors. And you select a blending mode, and you see both the result of their combination and the math used to produce it. So these blending modes come from Photoshop. You might have used these. They have exactly the same name in Photoshop. And it was Adobe that originally proposed them to the working group a few years ago. So why does this effect work? Because basically multiply just means what the word says. It multiplies the RGB components of each color. Notice here that the color in the middle is produced by just multiplying the red components and the green components and the blue components. And this is the color we get, this column here. So what happens then if the color in the foreground is white, which is 100% everything? You can see that basically if you multiply anything by 100%, what do you get back? You get the thing you multiplied, right? So any color you multiply with white, you just get that color, which is why our white text, see, we had this white text here, and that white text now became transparent, basically cut out, because it got combined with the background, and combining white with whatever gives us that whatever. Similarly, why did the black stay black? Because if we input black here, notice that if we multiply something with 0, what does it give us? It gives us 0, right? So if we multiply black, we get black. In general, multiply always gives us a color that is at least as dark as the darkest of the two colors. So this is why this works and gives us black for black, and cutout for white. So what do we do the opposite effect? When we have a white background and we want cutout text there, multiply won't work because of what I mentioned. The white becomes transparent and the black becomes black. So the screen blending mode comes to save us here, which gives us exactly what we want. And we can reason about it in the same way. If I select screen here, the math is a little more complicated. I'll give you a few seconds to process it. So notice, remember this is the result we have. Black becomes cut out and white stays white. So let me show you the white first. So with white, this component becomes 0, and it's 0 for all three of them. So this is getting multiplied by 0. So we have 100% for each of those three components, which gives us white. And that is why white stays white. For black, this component becomes 100%, so it's useless. It's just like multiplying by 1. And then this gives us 100% minus 100%, and this, because we have two minuses, it becomes a plus, so it gives us 80%. And same for the other two components. So basically, when we screen with black, we get whatever color we had behind, which is why it gives us the cutout text effect. So if you haven't heard about blending modes before, I know many of you might be wondering, okay, this is cool, Leah, but what about browser support? Browser support is pretty decent, actually, 86% of users. And remember, if blending modes are not supported, you actually get a pretty decent fallback. This is the fallback. It's still perfectly readable. You don't even need to do any ad supports or anything. So the takeaway from this first secret is that with multiply blending mode, black becomes cut out and white is opaque. And with a screen blending mode, white is cut out and black is opaque. And there are many interesting things to observe with other colors, so I suggest you play with the app a little bit afterwards. And if you discover something cool, let me know. So the second secret is using characters as images. Look at the background of this slide. It's actually using emojis and characters for the number 2. It's not images. So how does that work? So we're using, in this example, I'm using a data URI with an SVG. And contrary to what they've told you, contrary to what you've been told, you don't actually have to URL escape everything. You only have to URL escape very few characters. URLs actually have very few reserved characters, and everything else just works today. And also for CSS, when you have a multi-line string, you have to escape the line breaks, which is why every line ends with a slash. Yes, it's very annoying, and chances are, during this example, I'll probably forget it at some point, but you have to remember there's a slash at the end of every line, otherwise hell breaks loose. So here I have a circle, and I can make the background a bit smaller, and now I have many circles. But a circle is not very interesting, right? I could do this with a radial gradient if I wanted. What is more interesting is the text element. So SVG supports a text element for putting text in our image. You can't see anything right now because by default the baseline is 0, which means that the letter is outside my image. But now that I've given it a baseline of 1em, you can actually start seeing something. And let me make it a bit bigger. So I have a view box of 100 by 100 here, and I've given it a font size of 100. So I get a pretty big A. And that could mean I could put any characters here, or even better, I could put emojis here. And you know what's even better? Because it's just SVG, and SVG supports anything, almost anything that you're used to, you may see where this is going, except I have to escape this. I think it's %7b. What is the brace? Yeah, it's %7b. And I'm going to use a %7b here. There is our unicorn again. And I'm going to apply a transform, a rotate transform. And here I'm going to give it a style attribute with an animation of foo, 1 second, infinite, alternate. And maybe let's make it minus. So you can see here that not only you can use this technique to have images, but they could also be animated images. Who needs animated GIFs and APNG and all that? You could have SVG, which is much more awesome. And you can actually use this to style meter elements to look like rating widgets. Here, this is just a meter element. If I change it, I can get like all kinds of numbers. And it's just using this technique to style it. It's just using 2 stars as images with this technique. This star is faded out, and this star is not. And yes, I'm using this WebKit pseudo element here, but there's an equivalent one for each browser. If you look it up, there's a pseudo element for Firefox, and there's a pseudo element for Edge. And I hope eventually we standardize this, because I'm just as fed up about this as you are. But right now, we have to use these proprietary pseudo elements if we want to style meters. But the thing is, now that we've done that, we could turn this into a chocolate ice cream meter. Isn't that awesome? So the takeaways here is that you can turn glyphs into animated images with SVG data URIs. You should escape some characters, but not everything like people used to think we had to do. And you can use this trick to even style meters with discrete icons. But the wonders of SVG data URIs don't stop here. So the next secret is also related to SVG. Try to think how you would do this border with CSS. We can't do it with CSS without SVG. But we can do a lot of cool things with SVG. So it's worth looking more into it. So here I have a simple rectangle. It has a stroke width of 4 pixels. And there's a property called stroke dash array, which lets us have strokes with custom length of dashes and custom length of gaps. And there is also a stroke dash offset property that lets us move where these dashes start from. So look at what's happening as I'm reducing this. It's animating. And you know what's even better? You can animate this with a keyframe animation. So let's do that. Let's add a style element with a keyframes rule that we'll call marching ants. And it will make the dash offset not -94, but all we need is -15. Why -15? Because the dash length is 10 and the gap is 5. So 15 will get us exactly where we started. So if we continue this and if we animate infinitely, we'll get the marching ants effect. So let's apply the animation. Marching ants, marching ants, let's say 1 second, infinite. So you see that it sort of moves. Can you see what's happening in the back? So you see that it sort of moves, but it's not like what you would expect. It's as if it's getting tired at some point, and then it picks up again. The reason is that by default, the timing function of animations is ease, but we can add linear to make it linear. And now it's the proper marching ants effect that we know. We can make it a bit faster because that's a bit slow. Yeah, I like this better. So we can use it for like a selection or something, but right now this is just an SVG. So what we wanted was to apply it to an HTML element as a border. So I'm going to copy this here. And here, I have a div. It's just a div with a class of unicorn and look at my awesome border as a content. And here I have the SVG data URI ready, but I'll need to add some slashes. And another slash, and another slash. And there it is. And it's fully flexible. If I go here, because I've given it content editable so I can change it, if I go here and change it, it just adapts. It's just like a normal border, except it's cooler. Thank you. So what else? What other cool thing we can do with SVG? So here I have a simple rectangle with a 40-pixel blue stroke. That's not very cool. We can do that with CSS, normal CSS as well. But you know what else, what we can do with SVG that we can't do with CSS? Gradient strokes. So gradients in SVG are a little more awkward because they came way before CSS gradients. So they have a completely different syntax, which you can see here. But it's a little more verbose, but it basically does the same things. Let's make it #0AC, yep, this blue. And now you can't see it because I haven't applied it anywhere yet. So let's go here, where it sets the stroke to a color. Oh, and I need to give my gradient an ID. And here, I just say URL #wow, and now I have a gradient stroke. And I can also apply a gradient transform to make it a diagonal stroke. And yes, everything is different in SVG, like the way we specify angles, even the way we specify transforms. Notice that there's no degrees here. And if we try to specify the transform the same way as in CSS, it doesn't work anymore. So it's not ideal, but at least it lets us do a lot of really cool things. So now, like the previous time, we just have a rectangle here. How do we turn it into a cool CSS border on an HTML element? Same way. I will copy it here. Again, we have a div with a class of unicorn, and I'm going to go here and paste it in. Add some slashes. And there we are. Notice that because this is basically a background image, we don't get any offset, like the text is still overlapping our border. But we can do that easily with padding, and then it works just fine. Notice that even though my stroke width is 40 pixels, my padding is 20. Why is that? The reason is that the stroke I actually end up seeing is only half the stroke. The other half is on the outside. Yes, it's very weird. It will become more clear if I turn this into dashes, just like before. I'm going to do this. And then, now you still don't see it, but if I apply line cap round, well, and make my gaps a bit bigger, now you start seeing what's going on here. I can't really use round line caps because half of my stroke is on the outside. And what's even worse, there is no way to fix this. There's no easy way to fix this because we can't really say calc in the width and height. We can't say 100% minus 20 pixels because like most browsers don't support that. And there is a property that is supposed to control this, I think it's called stroke offset or offset stroke or something, but no browser supports it. So if you like these things, start pushing browsers a bit to implement more of the cool SVG features because they think we don't care. Seriously, that is why browsers are not implementing cool new stuff in SVG. There's a ton of stuff that is planned for SVG and browsers are just not implementing it because they think that developers don't care about SVG. So show them that they're wrong. Tweet about it. Tweet about SVG and how great it is. So, the takeaways from this is that SVGs with no view box, notice that I didn't specify any width or height or view box for these SVGs, they spread to cover the entire area, but strokes don't stretch. They stay the same width we specified, which is exactly what we want for borders like this. So, the fourth secret is about creating headings with a flexible line around them that just adjusts to the heading content. You don't have to animate them like they are over here. I just thought that was cool. But in a real website, please don't animate them. They will be just as annoying as a marquee tag. So here we have a heading. The only reason I've added content editable is so that I change its content afterwards and show you that it's really flexible. And here we have a before and an after pseudo element, which is the key for this. So the main idea is that I'm going to add some before and after pseudo elements here. I'm actually going to give them a content for now, but I'm going to remove that afterwards. This is just to show you what's happening. And similarly, I'm going to give this a background of yellow just to show you what's happening, but we're going to remove this afterwards. So the idea is that these pseudo elements are going to become our flexible lines by using the wonders of Flexbox. So right now, we don't see much of a change by applying flex because there's nothing to flex really. So let's give the heading a width of 100%, and let's make the pseudo elements flexible by using the flex shorthand. So now this is already starting to get there, right? So let's remove these horrible colors. And let's remove the A, because we don't need it. So now we're sort of getting there already. You can see it here. It's already nice and flexible, but it doesn't look very pretty. So what should we do? Let's reduce the height a bit. And now let's make it centered. This is already getting there. Let's make it thinner. And let's give it a bit of margin. And there we go. That's already one version of this effect. However, we could do other cool things as well. I mean, as you've seen in the cover of this, we could also give it a background and have stripes there. Another thing we could do is instead of having a background, we could have a border with a border width of the top and bottom being 0.1 and then left and right being 0. And actually, this is a bit too thick still. Maybe something like this. And maybe we could give it a gray color as well. So as you can see, the possibilities are infinite. But what happens when the heading becomes so big that there's no space anymore? Well, as you can see, we don't get the lines anymore, which kind of makes sense. So Flexbox just takes care of that without us having to do anything for when the text's too big. So the takeaway from the fourth secret is that text nodes and pseudo elements can be flex children and also grid items if you're using grid. We're going to use that later on. So the fifth secret is about having accessible CSS pop-up menus. I'm sure you've seen this many times. How many of you have done a pop-up menu like this with just CSS at some point in your life? Most of you, right? It's like one of the exercises that people do when they're learning CSS. So the problem with these menus is that they don't really work with the keyboard. So unlike what this heading is showing, the reality is more like this. So here I have a nested list, which I've styled to look like a menu. Again, the exact styling doesn't really matter, so we're not going to look at it. The only part we're going to look at is the part that shows and hides the menu, because that that is more relevant. The thing I want you to remember is that each menu item is an A element, and then there is a UL for the submenu with list items that also contain A elements. So if I click here, I focus on the projects menu, and if I have it open, I can actually tab through the submenu items. But that's not how it usually works for keyboard users. They don't like hover on the menu first and then use the keyboard. What really happens is that they focus on the first item and then they press tab. And nothing happens in the submenu. They don't even know there's a submenu. It just goes to the second item and the third item. So how can we fix that? One possible solution would be to open the submenu when the A item is focused. So we can use the A focus pseudo class and say a UL that is after a focused link should be displayed. So now, if projects is focused with the keyboard, the submenu does open, and now we can see that there's a submenu there. But what happens when we try to tab through? It disappears. It's not actually usable. It's just teasing us. Like here, there's a submenu, but you can't use it unless you use your mouse. Which is why, until now, using CSS to do these kinds of submenus was actually an anti-pattern unless you also used JavaScript. But now we got a new pseudo class called focus within that doesn't just match the focused element itself, but also all its ancestors. So how can we use this to our advantage here? So we are going to say the L item, if it has focus within it, then, can you still hear me? There's weird stuff happening with the microphone. Okay. So if the Li item has focus within it, then the UL inside it should display. So you can see that now, if I tab through, it actually works. And similarly, I can tab to blog, tab, 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 tab. It works just fine. It works like those menus that have JavaScript, except without the JavaScript. So focus within is fantastic for accessibility, and pop-up menus is just one example. You might wonder, what is the browser support for focus within? And it looks like I forgot to add a slide on that, but we can go to Can I Use quickly, and you can see that it's actually pretty decent. It's only Edge that's holding us back, and it has like 0.02% market share, and 1.67% here. You can always include like a fallback or a polyfill for Edge. So, also, in the future, we might also get target within, so that all these websites that use the target pseudo class to open or close certain items, now with target within, we would be able to display something when we don't have a hash on the URL. Target within would also be super useful. I can't wait to see it. But it's not there yet. No browser has implemented target within yet. So the sixth one is about variable fonts for non-variable strokes. What does that mean? It sounds very cryptic. I'm going to show you what it means here. So, but before I do, how many of you have heard of variable fonts? That few? Come on, if you've heard of variable fonts, raise your hand. Okay, well, the rest of you are in for a huge surprise. So, remember how in the beginning of computers, our fonts were not actually vector-based, but they were bitmap-based, and every size had to be drawn individually? And eventually, we got vector fonts that just scaled at any size. So variable fonts are an equivalent revolution as when we got vector fonts for the first time. It's like the second big thing that has ever happened to fonts. And what does it mean? So before variable fonts, each font had a certain number of weights, often just normal and bold. Sometimes, especially the fonts that are used by graphic designers a lot, they also had like extra light and normal and semi-bold and black and all these weights. And if you wanted to use those as web fonts, you had to include like 7 weights if you actually wanted all of them. And it was terrible for performance. But it's not just about performance. You could also not make small adjustments. It was either light or normal, nothing in between. Whereas with variable fonts, we get everything in between with just one font. And you can see, this is an awesome website for variable fonts, v-fonts.com. It has a ton of variable fonts. And it's not just weight that can change. Like here, you can also see width changing, also the slope, and everything is changing smoothly. Here you can see the serifs. Like this font goes from serif to sans serif with a different axis. Like basically, you can have all sorts of custom axes. There's even an emoji font here with a poop icon with the hat of the icon growing and shrinking based on an axis. Let me see if I can load this, because this website has the poop variable font as well. It's awesome. But I don't know if it will load. The Wi-Fi is a bit slow. I'm going to show you some of the others while we're waiting for it to load. You can see how like this has horizontal and vertical proportion. Here it's the contrast between the strokes that changes. Here it's like the swooshiness. And something loaded. There it is. So notice that if I change the axis, there's a cap height axis, except cap height here doesn't actually mean uppercase height, it means actual cap height. So yeah, variable fonts are super cool. And this secret that I'm going to show you here is only about one facet of them. So here I have a heading with multiple lines, and I've adjusted the size of each line, the font size of each line, so that it occupies the entire width. But do you notice something here? This looks awful. The strokes, the widths of the strokes of each character look completely different. Like, even though they all have the same weight, the R actually appears much bolder than everything else. And the first and fourth line appear thinner than everything else. So how can we fix it? Before variable fonts, we couldn't really do very much. Even if we had a font with like all weights that were a thing back then, all we would be able to do would be crude adjustments like font weight 100, which is way too thin. But so here I've included a variable font called FFmeta VF by Monotype. It's a free font. And notice that instead of the font weight descriptor giving us what weight this font is, it gives us a range. It has 2 values. It says this font is between 100 and 900, and you can get all of these weights from just this one file. And same with font style. It says it goes from normal to italic. And by the way, font display swap is a cool new property to look up. I'm not going to show it here, because it's kind of hard to demonstrate in a talk, but basically it means load the fallback while the web font is loading, and when the web font loads, then swap it, which is much better than the current behavior of some browsers. So let's see how variable fonts can help us here. So we can tweak each line individually. So even though 100 is too much, maybe 190 is a bit more appropriate. And similarly, even though 100 is too much, too little, 140 looks more appropriate. So, and the fourth one looks okay to me, so I'm not going to adjust it. So this is already useful, but what happens if I change the text there? What happens if I want to change, like, variable fonts are awesome, and I want to change it to, like, variable fonts are okay-ish, I guess, or something? Like, then I would have to painfully adjust the font size and the font weight again. And like every time I change anything, I have to adjust these separately. Is there any way to have a continuous expression that gives us what font weight we need to specify for each size? So there's a concept in maths. When you have a number of points and you want to find a curve that matches these points, there's a process called interpolation that gives you a polynomial which produces intermediate values. However, if you have a lot of points, interpolation can give you a very high degree polynomial, like x to the 7th, for example, which in CSS terms would mean like multiplying something painfully like 7 times, because we don't actually have powers in CSS. So we want something a little simpler. We don't care about the ultimate precision. We just want something that looks okay. So what we can do is, there's another math concept called regression. How many of you have heard of linear regression? It's usually in the concept of statistics. Okay, so linear regression just gives you a line. If you have a number of points, linear regression just gives you a line that matches these points, that comes as close as possible to these points. Obviously, if you have a lot of points, it cannot match all of them exactly. If you only have 2 points, it can match them exactly. So, and there's also what is called quadratic regression, which instead of giving you a line, it gives you a second-degree polynomial. So this sounds a little bit abstract, but don't worry about it, because we're going to apply it in practice. So I thought, what if we could use these techniques to derive a calc expression that will give us the font weight for each font size, so that we only have to adjust the font size. So the idea is, we would, instead of specifying font size with a property, the font size property, we would specify it with a variable. And then I would say font size var size. And then font weight would be some kind of calc expression that depends on size. But I'm going to comment this out right now until we have the coefficients. Also, because if in CSS we have m's, we cannot get anything that is not m's. We cannot get numbers from m's. So I'm going to change this to 1.5 and this to 2.8. And then I'm going to multiply the size here by 1m. So let's look back. Oh, and I'm going to set a default size of 1. Okay, so now we're back in the original situation. So I've made a linear regression calculator that piggybacks off of Wolfram Alpha. You've heard of Wolfram Alpha, right? Okay, so it's a website that lets you compute a lot of complex math things. So we can input the points we've discovered. So we've seen so far that when the size is 1, the weight is 300, because we've specified 300 here. When the size is 1.5, the weight is 190. And when the size is 2.8, the weight is, what was it? 140. So, 140. And now we see, I'll make this bigger. So now Wolfram Alpha gives us a line that tries to be as close as possible to all 3 of these points. So notice that this is not actually very good. Not only it doesn't match any of our points, but it's actually pretty far from all of them. And you can see here where it says plot of the residuals, it can be off by 40. An increase of 40 in the font weight has a very visible result. So this is actually pretty bad. I'm going to show you how bad. So, come on. Okay. For some reason, Wolfram Alpha gives me an image there, and I have to like copy the image so that it copies the alt text. It's terrible. So let's go here and put that expression in, but instead of x, I'm going to multiply by var size. So that should work. And let me comment this out so we can see the actual effect that we have. Actually, it's not that bad. Maybe we should just leave it at that. Well, so let's suppose we left it at that. What happens if we change the text? Because that's the real test. Otherwise, we could have just left the numbers we had. So let's say, for example, instead of like 4 lines, we want to make it 3 lines. So we go here, and we want to change the size. Wait, something's not right here. Oh, no. OK, never mind. So you can see that it's sort of less good now. I mean, it still loads better than what it was before we made this adjustment, but it could be better. So what can we do? We can add more points, and that way we'll get a different line, but there's a limit to what you can get with just the line. So another thing we could do would be to find the font weight for like a smaller number, because right now a size of 65 is completely outside the range of numbers we have already put into that calculation. It's not within the range of numbers we've specified before. It's outside of it. So it's even harder, and I'm actually surprised it did so well. I was expecting it to do much worse. In my tests before this talk, it did much worse. I'm not sure what I did differently. So we can test like what the correct font weight would have been. Let's say 360. It would have been like 350. And if we go here and add another point with 350, it gives us a different line, with this point being completely, really far from it. So we can select quadratic, which gives us a different curve that fits the points more closely. Do notice that if you remember math at school, where you were graphing second-degree polynomials, you remember that the shape is not actually like this. It's actually sort of like this. So at some point, this expression is going to be very inaccurate. At some point, it's going to start going up and giving you completely wrong results. So this will only work for a certain range, whereas the line approach will give you sort of reasonable numbers throughout. So let's try this. I'm going to actually make this bigger so you can see what I'm doing here. And I'm going to try to copy it again, which is torture. So you can see the line here, and you can see how far it is. And I'm going to go back and apply this expression instead. So I'm going to paste it here. And I'm going to replace those x's with my variable. And here as well. OK. So you can already see that it's sort of better. It's already fitting closer. But the real test is if we have different sizes. So let's try to go through. Oh, yes. That's why I was like, what the hell? Yes. And you can see now how all the intermediate sizes sort of make sense. We don't have to specify them all. We just had to find a few points and calculate that expression. And we didn't even have to calculate it ourselves. And what's even better is that once we find the relationship, oops, what did I do here? What was it? 543. Once we find the expression, we can use it for other purposes as well. So in what other case might this be useful? So well, at least the more design savvy of you know that A, it's bad to use synthesized subscripts and superscripts, and in the past, font designers had to include special glyphs for those smaller characters, because otherwise this happens. Notice that the citation needed superscript is much thinner than the rest of the text. And same with the acronym. Another typographic rule is that acronyms should be smaller, like all caps things should be smaller, so that they're more harmonized with the rest of the text and they don't stand out too much. But if we do that and the font doesn't have specially designed small caps characters, then this happens, where the strokes are much thinner. But variable fonts help us with that as well. And what's even better is that we don't have to calculate it again. We can just go here and paste the CSS we've already calculated. And then, we have to change the size here to font size, to the font size to size, and change this. But as long as we make that change, like, we don't have to change anything else. Like, our expression doesn't need to be calculated from scratch. It just works. And it already looks much better. So, the takeaways from this secret is that with variable fonts and making small adjustments to the font weight, we can do a ton of things that before variable fonts required special glyphs in the font and special faces in the font and all sorts of things from the font designer. Whereas right now, they don't have to put any extra effort in designing the font. And I say no extra effort because they used to design variable fonts before as well. Before OpenType variable fonts, the font designers actually designed an entire range and then had to export it in individual weights. The work for the variable font was already being done. It's not extra work for the font designers to create this variation. We just get to enjoy more of their work, their existing work. So these kinds of minor tweaks allow us to equalize strokes, synthesize small caps, superscripts, subscripts, a ton of things. And we can use linear or quadratic regression to avoid calculating the weight every time for these tweaks. It's not perfect, but it can help a lot. And it's definitely much better than just leaving the weight to whatever it normally is. So, the seventh secret has to do with Flexbox. And more specifically, responsive Flexbox, like this header is showing. So can you imagine how to do this layout with no media queries? And you might be wondering, what's wrong with media queries, Lee? I like my media queries. But sometimes media queries don't really work very well because your component might be used in many different places and its size doesn't really depend on the viewport, but on whatever it's inside. Like, the same component might be in many different places and have many different sizes. And yes, this is why we need element queries, but that's a whole different story. We won't get element queries anytime soon, so hacks like these are kind of the best we can do right now. So, let's suppose we have this sort of forum post type thing or message comment type thing. And let me show you what happens when I shrink the viewport. Well, or whatever it's inside. In this case, it's the viewport, but it could be other things. So notice that this is pretty horrible. It's pretty much unusable at this point. So what can we do? Let me walk you through the HTML first. There's a header element, which is the gray area here. And there is a post element that actually contains the message. And here, the parts of the CSS that are relevant to this is that the article has display flex and the post has flex 1 so that it stretches to accommodate any remaining space. One thing we can do to help things is to add flex wrap. And then, at least in small sizes, it automatically wraps. But this looks horrible. We wanted this to stretch horizontally. So what we can do is, we can add flex to the header as well. Whoops. And then the vertical layout works. But in fixing the vertical layout, I've broken the horizontal layout, because now this is huge. And why is it huge? Because the relationship between these two is basically one-to-one. Like, I'm basically saying these should stretch equivalently to fill any remaining space. But I don't really want that. So what I can do is, I can give this a really large number so that when it's horizontal and they're sharing the same space, we still get the same behavior as before. But when they're vertical, whoa, weird things happening here. But when they are vertical, the header still stretches horizontally because the default flex is 0, which means flex grow is 0, which means nothing stretches. So by giving it a flex of 1, we say you should stretch to cover remaining space. But because in the vertical layout there's nothing else there, it stretches to cover the entire remaining space. You might notice that at this point, this becomes very thin. But the rest of like normal CSS still works. We can give this a min width of, say, 15 ems. And that way we can control when it actually switches to a vertical layout. So now it never becomes too thin because it just switches to a vertical layout, and all without any media queries. So this is not actually my trick. This was published with the title Flex Grow 999 hack by someone called Joren van Hee, if I'm pronouncing his name right. You can follow him on Twitter over there. So the 8th secret is about auto-flowing grids, which again is kind of cryptic until we see what exactly it's about. So here we have a list of items. It doesn't really matter what items they are. They have classes. Some of them, half of them have a class of cat, and the other half have a class of human. And also half of them are male and half of them are female, and they're styled differently. The cats have a different background color, the humans have a different emoji. So let's assume that I wanted to display these items as 2 columns, where the humans were in one column and the cats were in the other column. How could I do that? I could use display grid, and notice that right now nothing happens because it has 1 column by default. So I apply grid template columns, and I say they should both be the same, and a grid gap of, say, 5 pixels. So notice that now they're automatically assigned to columns. So I have both cats and humans in both columns. So I want to specify what column each of them goes. So I say human should go to grid column 1, and then cat should go to grid column 2. But look at this. What happened here? So the reason this happened is that grids are laid out in rows by default. So it laid out the cats where it should, and then the humans went underneath. However, we can change this layout. There's a grid auto flow property where we can specify column, and this fixes that problem. So now they're properly sorted, just like I wanted. And if I wanted the humans to be in the second column and the cats to be on the first column, that works too. And it's completely independent of the source. Let's say I wanted to split them by gender instead. So I would say male in the second column and female in the first column, and that works too. So yeah, grid autoflow is a pretty cool property, and it doesn't just do this. Another example, you can see another example here, where I have a list of 10 cats. I'm going to refresh here because my scrolling is broken for some reason. Nope, still broken. OK, I'm going to use the scroll bars. So I have 10 cats here from a free stock photo website called Pexels. And I want to display them in a grid. Well, right now I haven't specified a template, so nothing happens. I can say grid template columns, and I use the repeat function to avoid saying 207 times or 4 times. So I want them to be in 4 columns and 4 rows of 200 each. And right now, it looks really weird because the images are still their full size. So I can say width 100% and height 100%. And then, OK, this, no. Oh, right, typo. So notice that I've just committed one of the 10 horrible sins of web design. I stretched images. But fear not, because Object Fit comes to the rescue, and it's supported everywhere, almost. So this looks kind of like a boring grid. So what I wanted to do is, I want to enlarge some of the cats. Let's say these, but I might decide otherwise when I see it. And say they span 2 columns. Oh, right, I need quotes. Yes. So they span 2 columns and 2 rows. So notice that now our grid looks kind of weird. There's no cut here. So how can I fix that? Grid autoflow to the rescue again. So I'm going to use the default algorithm, row, but I can also add a dense keyword after it. And now, things can be shifted up to cover any holes in the grid. Just for the lulz, if I said column, this is what the result is, because they're laid out in columns now. I think I prefer row. So, and this is the browser support for CSS Grid, in case you're not aware of it. It's basically 87% of users. Even Edge supports it. So if you were wondering about that, don't. CSS Grid is available everywhere. So the takeaways from this secret is that grid autoflow defines the direction that automatic grids are laid out. And I say auto grids because you could also explicitly say where everything goes, and then grid autoflow has no effect. But in most cases, you don't want to do that. Also, the dense keywords prevents holes in the grid by shifting things up as necessary. And object fit cover prevents image distortion. Also, object fit contain and a bunch of other values. But cover makes the image as big as possible and prevents distortion. So the 9th secret is about pie charts. I'm sure you've seen linear gradients in CSS, right? And you might have seen radial gradients as well. So soon we're getting a new type of gradient called conic gradient, where the colors go around a ray that goes around the midpoint. And the colors are added like a normal gradient. And there is also a from argument that rotates the gradient. So, I like this. It looks kind of like a weird shadow. And here I have a div element that I've called pi, and I've given it a linear gradient, which I'm going to convert to a conic gradient. Does that remind you of anything? A hue wheel on color pickers. Now we could make that with CSS. But we can make more cool things. So if I remove these colors and then increase this, let's say I make it 40%, and then I decrease this, at some point they meet, and then I get a hard line, which is a pie chart. And actually notice that this happens regardless of what, as long as the second number is smaller than the first, it doesn't matter what it is. It could be 0. So I tend to use 0 there, both as a convention to indicate what should be happening, and also so that it works with whatever value. So now I basically have a pie chart that works with whatever number I put here. And I could also specify a value CSS variable that holds the 30%. And here I could say var value. And then I could also specify this in the style element or via JavaScript. This is why CSS variables are so much superior over Sass variables. Try doing that with Sass. So I can change it in the inline style, again, or via JavaScript, and my pie chart just adjusts as necessary. It's like almost like a component. And you know what's even cooler? OK, I'm going to take this out of the inline style now so that we have all our code in one place. But what's even cooler is that the second parameter of var is a default value. And by doing that, I can have multiple slices of the pie. Let's say I want to add the potential for a second color. So I could do this. Let's give it a fixed value now. And let's say black here. We have a full German flag now. I don't know why I chose a German flag. So notice that now it works just fine. And actually, in newer browsers, I can do this. It's a new syntax. It's currently only supported by Chrome. So you should have the 2 consecutive color stops. But this was implemented at the same time as conic gradients. So if a browser supports conic gradients, they probably support this syntax with the 2 positions as well. So now I can have a second variable here with a default value of 0, so that when this variable is not set, I just don't get that color. But I could set that color to something, and then I get it just fine. Notice that the numbers I specify are not in addition, they overlap. Like 60% is the total angle of the yellow, not the difference it has from the red one. So that way, I could add a ton of colors. Let's say 3 and 4, and I could have like lime and let's say aqua here, and they only appear if I actually set values for them. So I could do value 3, let's say 80%. And basically that way I can have a pie chart component that shows whatever percentages I want with however many slices I want, just with a few lines of CSS. Yeah, I like pie charts too. Thank you. So another cool thing is, let's say I have just one slice for simplicity here, but everything applies to multiple slices as well. Notice that as I'm changing this, it sort of looks like it's animating, which kind of begs the question, wouldn't it be cool if I could actually animate this? That way I could make like a pie chart progress indicator. So I add my keyframes rule, and I call it progress. I'm terrible at picking names for keyframes. I hate that we have to pick a name for everything, for every animation. And then let's say to value 100%. And then I go here, I set this to 0, and I try to add an animation that sets for progress, 1 second infinite. But look at what happens. It just jumps from 0 to 100. And the reason for this is that by default, CSS variables are non-animatable because the browser pretends that it doesn't know how to animate them. Even though it's obviously a percentage, the browser's like, yeah, I don't know what you've typed there. Who knows? You could have typed red instead of like 100%. I don't know what you're doing. I'll just give up. So how can we fix that? The good news is there is some JavaScript we could write to fix that, to register this property. And we can say this property is a percentage, and we can also say whether it inherits and what its initial value is. This is part of a set of new specs called Houdini, which is going to give developers the power that before was only for browser engineers. And if I run this snippet and I go back, now it works, which I think is really cool. I'm going to make it even cooler. Woohoo! So, isn't this awesome? No. Chrome is supposed to ship it really soon. Like, we've actually cleared it in the working group. Even though the spec itself is not ready, we've said that, OK, this part of the spec can be shipped. Like, we had a meeting, we approved it. I don't know why it hasn't shipped yet. Like, I've talked to the Chrome engineer that implemented it, and he told me that it was meant to ship in April, so I'm not sure what it's holding it up, but I expect it to ship in Chrome very soon. And it says here that it's in development in Safari as well, and WebKit. So hopefully, in a few months, the situation will be very different. And these days, browsers auto-update, so we don't have to wait years to get it. But this situation is also pretty bad. Even in Chrome, this is behind a flag, and Chrome, the Chrome people are those pushing this. So, yeah, I guess there's issues to be ironed out here. But I'm very excited about both of these. I can't wait until they actually make their way in browsers properly and we can play with them in real websites. So, some takeaways from this. Conic gradients are coming, finally. I proposed them 5 years ago, and I've been putting so much work into them. I'm so glad that it's finally happening. Also, 2 color stop positions for bands of colors in gradients, and not just conic gradients, but also all gradients. That's coming too. A color stop position of 0 creates hard lines regardless of the previous position. And CSS.register property will allow us to animate custom properties, opening up a lot of cool use cases. So the last secret, and I'm horribly over time. So the last secret is called descendant grid items, primarily because I could not think of a better name. And this is why it's not really styled, because it's really hard to visualize this concept. But let me show you what it's about. This is a very common markup for login forms. It has 2 labels, username, password. By putting the input inside the label, we avoid having to give it an ID. Which is always nice, because I hate specifying IDs. And let's say we wanted to use grid layout to display it as a grid. So we apply display grid. By default, it puts everything in the same column, which is why they're now under each other. But notice there's no grid. So we say grid template columns, and we want the first column to be auto, because that's the size. We want it to adapt to whatever the label actually is, like username or password. We want it to be as big as that. And the second one is basically whatever remaining space exists. But notice that we got a completely different result than what we were hoping for. But actually, the browser just did what we told it to do. We applied a grid on the form. The form has 2 children. It put these 2 children in 2 columns, which means the labels are next to each other. So how can we fix that? Until recently, we couldn't fix that. But there is a new display property called display contents, and that basically tells the browser to not to ignore this element when it comes to applying CSS. So now it ignores the labels when applying grid layout, and also notice that the labels don't have any styling either. So they're basically completely transparent as far as CSS is concerned. It's as if the layout is as if the label element was not there. But we still have our nice semantic HTML, our nice accessible labels, but they don't get in the way of our layout. And now we can have username and password in the two inputs in grid cells, just like we wanted. And if we make this bigger, the grid just adapts. And let's give it a nice gap as well, because I don't like this. Yep. Another use case is when you have a website layout and you want to use proper markup and use a header element for the header, but you actually want elements inside the header to be on the main grid of the page. As you can see here, we would want these elements inside the header to participate in the overall page grid. And display contents doesn't have amazing browser support, but it's very decent and it's constantly growing. As you can see, more than 1 in 2 users has it. Basically, 2 out of 3 users have it. So the takeaways from the last secret is that display contents allows us to make descendants flex or grid children, even though they're descendants and not actually children. And also, as I've mentioned before, text nodes are flex and grid children as well. So this is basically what I had for today, but before I thank you, 2 things. Since we don't have time for questions, because I went horribly over time, I'm going to be in the speaker area. Bruce mentioned where that is. I don't remember it, but hopefully I'll find it. I'll be in the speaker area. You can come and ask me questions. Seriously, don't be shy. I like getting questions. I like hearing what you thought. And also, I would love to hear, which secrets did you like? Which secrets did you not like? Which secrets did you already know about? Because that will help me adapt future talks as well. So if you want to tell me which ones you knew and which ones you didn't know, I would love to hear that feedback. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this.